So just a real brief recap of, an outline of what we're going to go over today. Do a quick summary. I know most of you are very familiar with hydro-ecologies. Just do kind of a quick summary of what that is and what the components are, mainly so when I say this, you know what I'm referring to versus what, there might be other definitions. Discuss a little bit about hydrology's influence on ecological patterning, because like I said, with ecological design, we really try to focus on, and the good designers do, on really those first principles. If you think even, Elon Musk and his sector, or, Charlie Munger and investors, they kind of focus on first principles. That's sort of what we do with ecological design. To be very successful, what are the first principles of design? And hydro-ecology is a big part of that. Hydrology really is a design driver for a lot of our work. So how that influences on ecological patterning, so by understanding that, then we can start utilizing that in our design work. Hydro-ecology, so just defining terms, obviously there's potentially several definitions for this. When I'm referring to hydro-ecology, I'm referring to that dynamic system where water interacts with these abiotic and biotic factors, like, the chemical, physical, biological elements that are on site, and those processes and how that interacts with the water, how water affects that, and how that really drives what living biological systems are there, what types of living material, plant material, animals exist there, how are they distributed, and then the health of those systems. So looking at the components of hydroecology, what we'll be focusing on today is mainly the water and the plant life, but I'd be remiss if I didn't add in there that soil types are incredibly important, not just and with microorganisms, because soil type, not just in the chemistry and the structure of that soil, but the biological factor of that as well. As a matter of fact, and I'll go into, how we approach in design, how we approach some of our process, but one of the main things that we do is we don't just do a soil assessment regarding the soil types and send it to the lab, see what the elements, the chemical properties are. We also do biological assessment as well, where we put it under the microscope, see what kind of levels of bacteria and fungi and all that are there, because that can really drive what happens with plant matter as we put that in the ground. It can tell us how the health of that system is going, what that system tends to, and a lot of that is driven by the interaction with the water, the plant life, and I mentioned microorganisms, but also the larger fauna. And I'll use the example of in the arid environment, you typically do have water in the arid environment, but where it exists is a low water table, some usually, relatively low water table somewhere deep down there. So you don't have it at the surface. You'll get the dew that occurs sometimes at night because you have significant temperature fluctuation. So we've actually used that sometimes as a design driver in arid and hyper-arid environment, using the dew that can be collected by different methods and tactics. And then it also exists in the stomach of the ruminants in that area. So those actually have the moisture that exists in ruminant stomachs actually has a significant impact on that ecology in terms of not just seed dispersal and germination, but also the nutrient cycling that can happen there. It just moves very slowly because obviously there's not as much moisture as we had. And then one of the parts that are significantly overlooked a lot of the time is the fungi. So for those not really familiar with mycelial networks, yes, if you think mushrooms are the fruiting body of huge underground mycelial networks. As a matter of fact, the largest organism that we know of, living organism on the planet, is a mycelial network out in Oregon. And so these fungal networks not only contribute to soil structure through glomalin and allowing pore space and soil aggregate, but they also allow a lot of nutrient exchange, and they can take water from distant areas and move them up to tree roots. As a matter of fact, working with agroforestry, probably about 80% plus of the plants we work with have an endophytic relationship. So a lot of the plants have a relationship with fungi. About 10+% might be exophytic, where the fungi surround the root and they exchange through a medium. But 80 to 90%, somewhere in there, have an endophytic relationship where the fungi actually enters the root hair and they exchange nutrients directly in water and moisture. So fungi play a big role. I say all that because while we'll focus on the water body, water and plant life, it's important to remember that those things are part of that. And so when we look at how hydrology and water can really shape landform. Not only do we have it at that level, but at the macro level. So in some cases, the entire landform is shaped by the hydrology. And for example, a river delta, floodplains, wetlands, when you look at some of the river systems, like if you look at the Rosgen classification of river systems, Class D, which are just like the ones that have different fingers going around, that entire landscape, like river deltas, is shaped entirely by the hydrology of that area, that system. So one of the important things to remember as we're talking about the components with water bodies is that when you think of a water body, a lake, river, pond, stream, typically you think of, that water and in terms of its bank being the limits. But it's important to remember, and as you all know, you've studied Darcy's Law and that kind of thing, that it's not limited to that. So it's very important. That river, that water body is not isolated. It's part of the surrounding groundwater system. So much so, like I have a place near here in West Virginia, and it's very close to that. There's karst geography where you could have a wetland and then 100 meters plus. That way you could have another little wetland or ephemeral pond, and they're directly connected through that limestone karst geography. And this comes into play not only in terms of understanding how that water moves through that soil profile. There's places with river systems in the United States, and I'll apologize, I'll probably use the U.S. as my examples just because I'm more familiar with that. But where the water you see in that water body, in certain areas of that water body, in certain areas of a river system, it's actually the majority of the water that you see did not come from upstream. It came from the groundwater that's contributing to that water body. And so, looking at that through not just the groundwater, that's saturated, unsaturated zone, and moving up the lawn, but this also contributes and impacts in the constructed environment. So it's a little more obvious in the natural environment, but as we work in that constructed environment, understanding how as we form water bodies, that can impact the surrounding ecosystem, the surrounding ground. If you're right up against matter of fact, one of the kind of the rule of thumb that we use for rain gardens and stormwater management is making sure that you keep them a certain distance away from structures because it can affect the foundation. But that can also help drive what your goals are, what the stakeholder goals are in terms of, hey, can we use this to infiltrate water? And we often do with stormwater. So that's also part of how that's important to remember that water is connected to the surrounding environment and not just isolated within its banks. So talked a bit about water as a component, just touched briefly on plants as a component, and just kind of as a reminder that, thinking in broad terms of categories of plants and how that's impacted by the hydroecology, and we'll talk a little bit too about how plants impact that, but how are plants impacted by that. And in terms of a broad system, just remembering that it's not just the plants we typically deal with in the landscape environment or even the agroforestry. I know you all are going to be focused more on the human use, not so much the agroecology use. But just remembering from submerged aquatic vegetation all the way through I should probably go this way, all the way going uphill from submerged aquatic vegetation to obligate wetland plants and environments that are pretty much always flooded to, going up there, some often flooded, sometimes flooded, and in the upland plants, that it's really driven a lot of times by hydroecology, and that varies biome by biome. And understanding how these plants tend to interact with a hydrology in their native environment can help us, one, dealing with them as we're interacting with them, but also, two, when we're looking at what plants to use in our work, well, looking at the system, I'll go a little bit of this into using hydroecology in design work, but really what plants want to be there, and not to anthropomorphize nature, but what plants want to be there, what plants don't, because that can make our life a lot easier in designing it, and also the long-term maintenance and management of that landscape. So some of the ways that hydrology shapes the environment, and some of this is obvious, but so looking at this along with temperature, wind, other abiotic and biotic conditions, what are some of the ways that hydrology shapes the landscape or shapes the environment? And thinking of that with the water being availability, how it moves, the movement of water across a landscape, through a landscape, and quality. Anybody want to venture a guess on that? Anybody contribute? You're kind of sitting pretty far back there, so I don't even know if I could hear you from where I'm at. And it's pretty early in the morning. So, all right, I'll go ahead with that. So how does that hydrology impact the form? You're going out from the broad scale, along, like I said, along with temperature and the different abiotic and biotic factors. Hydrology really drives the climate. And it's important to, as we look at that and narrow that down, it drives the climate, it drives the biome formation, how that's regulated down into the ecosystems. And within that ecosystems, the hydrology often drives how those species are distributed, how many are there, where are they distributed to, how do they interact with one another, and then down to the small scale the microbiome, the ecosystem that exists beneath our feet in the soil system. And so formation, composition, but also in the micronutrient cycling and the soil biology and how all of this creates habitat. That hydrology really drives a lot of that. And when we think about climate, we're pretty much, most of us are familiar with this image, what I'll refer to as a large water cycle. And spoiler alert, if I'm talking about a large water cycle, I'm probably going to end up talking about a small water cycle. But the large water cycle where, the brief Cliff Notes version, for those of you old enough to remember Cliff Notes, water evaporates over the ocean due to pressure and temperature and different gradients, gets moved inland, and then condenses and falls out, either infiltrates, comes back to the ocean over a long period of time as groundwater stored in aquifer, or runs off on the surface and back to the ocean. And that's accurate. That is not, when I talk about the short water cycle, that's not to take away from this. And depending on where you're at continentally, this may be the main driver of your climate. But as studies began, and Professor Milan did a lot of study. He did work, and unfortunately he passed recently, but did work and really focused on why the rainfall patterns were beginning to disrupt. They were starting to lose rainfall in the European area, and then it kind of expanded into that entire Mediterranean area. And he kind of put it poetically. That's why I throw this quote in here: water begets water, soil is the womb, and vegetation is the midway. And I added this because not only do I like the poetic nature of it, but it speaks to what we're talking about here, where water begets water. Water causes more water, but it's through the vegetation that water is driven. And we'll get to how that works in a moment. And then Masanobu Fukuoka, who, if you're familiar, he's pretty well known in the permaculture world with One Straw Revolution. He was kind of ahead of his time, but he was delivering a speech where he had to fly over the Southwest. He was on his way to California, and it was in an American desert that I suddenly realized that rain doesn't fall from the heavens, it comes from the ground. Desert formation is not due to the absence of rain, but rain ceases to fall because the vegetation has disappeared. And so when we're looking at just that large scale, and we'll dial down into the smaller scale because, most of us who are working on the smaller scale projects, but aggregated, that can have a significant impact on climate because not only does it drive the hydrology and the short hydrological cycle, but it also cools. It acts like air conditioning. So if you all are familiar with the term indigenous local knowledge, that's something that has been overlooked in the scientific community, had been overlooked for a long time, and is starting to have some serious consideration given to it, and rightfully so, because there's, people over the decades would say, oh, we came up with this discovery. Well, you didn't discover it. It was actually known by the indigenous folks that inhabited that area for a long time. It's just discovered by our culture. So I use this as an example because I wish I had looked it up briefly, didn't find the origination of this, but there was a tribe in the Amazon where the tribal leader was quoted as saying, because he had seen the deforestation occurring for lumber, and he said, well, if you cut down all the trees, who will call the rain? And so his comment was dismissed as, folklore and just a local, kind of that local storytelling. Ends up, he was actually right. So they've done a significant amount of study in the Amazon, and there's different terms for the theories and concepts that go with that, but the biotic pump. So you have, the Amazonian river system, huge amounts of water moving from inland to out sea, but all that water goes back, gets cycled back in through, some people refer to it as the biotic pump, can be called rainfall recycling sometimes in the scientific literature, but a huge amount, kind of an atmospheric river moving inland. And the trees of the Amazon actually drive a lot of that. So they'll release volatile organic compounds and bacteria that will go up and they release rain-forming nuclei. So these bacteria and VOCs go up and actually seed the clouds for raindrops to condense around them and fall as rain. And not only do they do that, but they do it in seasonal patterns as well. So the trees literally are calling for the rain to come in. So on average, a study I read a few years ago said the average, just to kind of condense it down, that the average raindrop that falls in the Amazonian basin doesn't just fall and run out in the river. It falls on average about 7 times before it actually makes it back to the ocean. So that's important to understand, because when we talk about the short water cycle, that has a significant impact. But in terms of large climate change concerns, addressing climate change, yes, we need to reduce fossil fuel consumption and draw down atmospheric carbon. Yes, we need to, restore biodiversity. There's a lot of things that we need to do, but some of those things, some of those effects we won't feel the impact for a significant amount of time. That doesn't mean we don't need to do it. We still do. But one of the shorter term interventions that we can do is by restoring these landscapes, we can actually impact the amount of rainfall that occurs. And what that does, if you think about it, if anybody is familiar with how air conditioning works, as it evaporates, changing it from a liquid to a gas state, that absorbs a significant amount of energy. So yes, energy with the laws of thermodynamics isn't destroyed, but it gets transferred into the atmosphere then, whereas it condenses as rain and releases that energy. Well, now then some of that energy has a better chance to escape out of the Earth's atmosphere back into space, and it acts a bit as an air conditioner. And, we can feel that to some degree when we walk, if you're outside and not necessarily out in the sun, even if you're in the shade and then walk into a forested area, often you can feel how significantly cooler it is, not just because of the shade that's there, but that system has that localized effect and aggregated. I forgot to look this up, how much this is in kilometers. Apologies, I know it in square miles, but about 36 square mile of reforestation can actually start to impact and have a noticeable effect on average of the cooling effect and the impact on the rainfall. And I say that there's actually a ranch that's out near the Chihuahuan Desert that, now granted, it's a very, very large ranch, but they've started to use holistic management practices that increase the ground cover in that ranch. Now it's an arid, semi-arid environment. So yeah, there's trees there, but kind of think savanna. So there's grasses. But since they've started that, they have actually had, and other people, third parties have measured this, that they've had more rainfall, measurably more rainfall on their property than they have in the surrounding properties. So yes, correlation does not always equal causation, but it points to that management practice. Now, it's not a significant amount of rainfall, but it's measurable that has had the effect that it actually has increased the water locally. So while we still look at that large scale rain pattern, we also want to consider the small rain pattern as well, or a small water cycle. So that kind of leapfrogging through the landscape. And if we interrupt that leapfrogging through the landscape, not only do we cause issues potentially with drought localized, but we break that short rain cycle, and that can disrupt further out too. And then you get cycles of drought, then you get cycles of drought, then fire, and then drought, then fire, then flooding, which tends to be the cycle that we often see because of this. And I could nerd out on that for a lot longer, but I won't, because that's not why we're here, and we'll focus on back to the task at hand. But by understanding that at the macro level and down to the micro level, then we can start designing with that. And like I said, aggregated over a large area, that can actually significantly have impacts in not just our climate and rainfall, or not just our rainfall, but our climate. So quickly going to mention some other plant hydrology dynamics. Hydraulic lift, and not something that we use often with design, but it exists, and it's important to know that. And yeah, it might be useful where deep-rooted plants, if any Anybody know what the deepest rooted plant measured in the world is? There's a ficus that in South Africa that was measured with a root system that goes 400 feet, so almost 122 meter deep. So these root structures with hydraulic lift, if you have those deeper seated root structures, they can get down, especially in seasonal variation water tables where, during the wet season, it's up here where all the roots are happy because they have access to the water. But as that water table lowers throughout a dry season, now those shallow rooted trees can't get to the water, but the deeper rooted trees can. So the question was, well, how are those faring and how do they still stay hydrated during that dry season? Well, while we look at nature as a competition of survival of the fittest, and that exists, that is true, but there's also a lot more collaboration and cooperation than we realize. So those deeper rooted trees will actually grab that water, pull it up through hydraulic lift, and make it available to the shallow rooted trees. And we see it with mycelial networks where trees will share not just with their own species, but with other species will share nutrients and resources. And it's a symbiotic relationship because perhaps that smaller tree fixes some nitrogen and gives some fertilization to that tree, or maybe that smaller tree releases a compound that deters the pest that would normally attack that larger tree, but it actually acts protecting. So it kind of forms its own little polyculture there of trees that collaborate, work together to be healthier overall. So that's one. Phytoremediation is another one. I recently worked on a design charrette for a place in the south end of the Chesapeake in Norfolk where they do a lot of gas and oil shipping, offloading and unloading. This site was a brownfield site where a brownfield is just a contaminated site that they want to clean up, and there's not federal money there like what we call a Superfund site. The feds come in, pay for it to clean up. This one, they didn't have it. So the owners, while they're keeping it in gas and hydrocarbon movement and storage and offloading and unloading from the tankers because it's right next to the bay, want to do the right thing. And they not only have the pollution from decades of hydrocarbon usage on that site, but previously to that, there's some legacy pollution that involves heavy metals and other compounds. Well, to try to clean that up, because the problem is as the rainfall hits, that water moves through the soil and it can mobilize those compounds and those pollutants and take them into the water column where they're even more of a risk. And so, yes, you can dig them up, but that's one, very expensive. Two, you run the risk of mobilizing all of those components, compounds, heavy metals, and moving them anyways. And three, you still have to deal with all that land. Well, with phytoremediation, utilizing plants, the plants put the roots down on so they don't disturb and disrupt the soil, so they don't mobilize that, but they'll take those compounds. Sometimes they'll break them up in mycelium. There's a mycelium recorded doing that in hydrocarbons where they'll break down the actual oil, but they can break some of those compounds down, or they can take those compounds in, like, with heavy metals, some of those being elemental that you're not going to break down an element. So it can lock it up in another compound where it makes it inert, or at the very least locks it up in that plant tissue, and then that plant tissue can be removed and dealt with either in a place that can remediate that significantly cheaper than trying to remediate, excavating the soil or remediating that, or at least you have yes, you're moving the problem from one area to another, but it's not as high a risk of an area. And then plants can also affect not just flow moderation but the water filterance, not just quantity but quality as well. So that as that water moves across that landscape or through that landscape, those plants can moderate the flow. So reducing, we had that hydrograph here where we see that dotted line was what that watershed of forest stream, how much water was measured during a rain event. That same rain event, once that place was developed, you have a lot of impervious cover now due to, roofs and streets and sidewalks. So that flash floodiness where you have all that water at once, well, as we deal with the built environment, as many landscape architects do, utilizing plants to slow down that water and to clean it up for when it hits that. And with this slide, we see just the different, estimated percentages of how natural ground cover is, how much that runoff increases when something's urbanized. But if developed with a low impact, how we can still reduce that runoff. We can't quite get back to the natural environment, but low impact development, we can significantly reduce that. And a lot of that is done through plants. And, we'll talk a little bit later. Matter of fact, we'll talk about it now, about designing with hydro-ecology, utilizing those plants. We can often do this a lot cheaper. So another example would be, we're using nature-based solutions to accomplish our goal. And by understanding, now we'll get into this design side of things, by understanding what's happening, those interactions, how hydrology not only impacts the surrounding environment in terms of hydroecology, how the plant systems impact the hydrology, understanding those principles can help us design our landscapes in ways that, one, accomplish what we need to accomplish, because, we still have human use. So, but by utilizing these nature-based solutions, there's buzzwords in the business now like green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, and ecosystem services. But by understanding that, and that's what ecological design really focuses on, is how can we utilize, instead of fighting against nature, which is difficult, one, that damages our ecosystems, and then we lose the ecosystem services provided by that. Talk a little bit more about that later. But if we stop fighting that and work with it, not only does that make our life easier, but it also, these natural patterns and processes will often do the work for us if we understand how they work, how they operate, and how to align our goals and our design with those processes. So it makes it easier, and it makes it significantly cheaper too. So when you were dealing with stakeholders, a lot of you may work for you may have your own business, you may be working for a firm, or you may be working for a municipality or the government, those stakeholders. And this can be the challenge of explaining how these nature-based solutions can actually lower the amount of cost, not only in construction of green infrastructure versus gray infrastructure, but long-term maintenance can be significantly cheaper too. So we're working with budgets. And a lot of times when you're trying to drive forward sustainable and regenerative practices in landscape management, they're all great ideas, but for folks whose job it is to manage a budget, when you're speaking with them, speaking in terms that are important to them and that they understand, and sometimes that's the, how much money that's going to cost, may be the way to achieve that goal. And so it's a kind of a win-win for the natural environment and for the built environment. And one of the things we can do just at the start, and we've noticed this with when COVID happened, that human activity kind of came to a grinding halt in some areas. Well, the natural systems rebounded incredibly quickly and incredibly resiliently. So sometimes they're kind of like triage. If anybody has any kind of medical background, stop the bleeding first, and sometimes that's enough. So when we're dealing with ecosystem services and some of this green infrastructure, sometimes it doesn't even need. I'll use some of the examples of some of the ecological restoration practices or restoration projects that I've worked on, and even within the watershed management, is we didn't really even have to do a whole lot of design. We just have to stop the thing that was doing the damage, and the natural system and process took care of itself. Nature, not to anthropomorphize nature, but nature has figured out the most effective and efficient way. Millions of years of evolution, this is the most efficient way of doing it. Yes, due to the fact that we have kind of cheap energy-ish with oil and machinery and technology, the actual pattern and process still is probably the most efficient way to do that. We can tweak that with human intervention, but by understanding that, we can move things along in the desired trajectory, and sometimes all that means is stopping the thing that does the damage. And then with design, we tend to go from there's a term started by P.A. Yeomans out of Australia, but it's kind of grown into morphed into other things, but the scale of permanence. So when we're designing, we start with broad patterns, understand these broad patterns and processes. That's kind of why I spoke towards the climate factor, and then dialing down into the biome and the ecosystem. So start with patterns, and the broad patterns, work towards the details, and then decide what is the most appropriate strategy and tactic to use. So like with climate, we're not really going to change the climate on a broad scale. I'll mention in a little later how we can actually do it on a small scale with microclimates. But the climate you have is the climate you have. And yes, as said earlier, you can do a little bit of intervention there, but you have to do it at such a large scale to impact what that climate is. So we look at it more or less in terms of the climate we have is what we have. And then the landform. So yeah, we can do earthworks and that kind of thing, but the landform, I have a property in West Virginia where, if you're familiar with West Virginia, if you set a basketball down here, by the time it gets 30 meters out that way, it's doing about 40 kilometers an hour because it's on a hillside. You're not going to change the landform, so work with the landform as you have it. But then you start getting into things that you can impact. You have the precipitation you have, but how can you manage that precipitation? Now we're able to, from land earthworks to water management, and then down to where we put our roads. Roads and pathways and access can be a source that moves water and helps. We can utilize that to manage hydrology, or it can be a point of significant erosion and problems. And then down to the forestry, where we put the plants, the buildings, and that kind of thing. So we'll get a little bit more into that when we talk, but from a process perspective, looking for those natural patterns and processes, what we do is we start with a large-scale site assessment. We go, significant data mining into the biotic, abiotic conditions of a site, really understanding what that site is, and then by understanding the site, the biology, the chemistry, the climate, the rainfall patterns, all of these things can help us really inform our design to design it in the most appropriate manner. And sometimes, especially for those of you working in suburban and urban environments, a site that you might be working on, and if you're not familiar with the climate, because maybe you're working like with us, we work all over the world, so we'll get into a climate that we have to research it, but understanding the specifics of that specific site can be difficult. Well, is there a reference site nearby that we can utilize that has sort of the same conditions that will kind of inform and drive our design a bit? Because if we see what happens at that site, we know what we can more or less expect here to some degree. And so, again, we're speaking mostly of hydro-ecology, so hydrology as a design driver. We look for that climate data. We look for the rainfall, how much rainfall is naturally occurring now, but we also look historically because we want to know has that rainfall changed, because depending on, especially as weather patterns get a little more wonky, we'll use the scientific term wonky, as weather patterns start to disrupt a bit more, where we expect, we're at the season where we would expect a certain rainfall pattern. It may not be, but even though that's its natural pattern. So we look at the historic data, and we also look at the projected data. So looking at climate projections, they're not a crystal ball, but they have an idea of what direction they might go. And that's important in designing, especially when we look at water and plants, plant-wise, because you don't want to put plants in there if you're in an area that is projected to get, say, more arid. So we're projecting out maybe in 20 years less rainfall and slightly warmer. Well, you don't want to necessarily use plant material that is kind of at the threshold now, where if it gets any drier, you're going to have to irrigate all the time. Where if you can select plant material that is more suited, yes, survives and thrives now, but is more suited, can also do well as that climate in that localized area dries out a little bit and gets a little warmer. And then major storm events, and that's one of the reasons we also look historically, or what to expect in the major storm events. And that's a significant design driver, because not only, are you designing to take stormwater, for example, and I put that hydrograph back on because that major storm event, not only are you looking at, okay, do we need to treat this, especially in stormwater, or if we're looking in the agroecology world where we do a lot of work, the structures, the strategies, and things that we use to manage that water. All right, if we plan for the normal rainfall, but we have to design it to survive those major storm events. That 100-year storm, in some areas we're seeing, every decade or two now. So yeah, we may not be treating for that 100-year, maybe we're designing for the 1-year storm event in terms of what we treat, but we want it to be able to survive the 5, 10, 100-year storm event because it's happening more and more frequently, and we don't want to put, the effort, time, money on all that into that, and then have it just wiped out by one major storm event because we thought, well, it's only once in a century, but we just got the second one in a decade, last year. So that can help. That can really drive some of the design as far as what kind of tactics and how robust you build it, but it also impacts the budget. And so again, going back to, I mentioned it before, I think but understanding the context. So those conversations and interactions with stakeholders, whether that stakeholder is, a private client asking you to design a landscape for their house or for their estate, or you work, downtown Toronto and you're working with stormwater management there, understanding the context of, what are the needs? What does that end user need? What is the ecosystem that we're designing in? What are the conditions that we're designing for? What is the budget? What is the long-term budget? Do we have, if we put a natural system in that requires a little bit of maintenance, do they have the maintenance staff to do that? Where over time it can be cheaper than a gray infrastructure, but if they don't have the maintenance staff to handle that, well, then understanding, hey, we have to contract out and projecting that. So how does flora impact hydrology design? The first one, it's not so much an impact, but very helpful for us. Like, I use the example, what if you get into an ecology you're not familiar with? Well, plants can be very good indicators of what the hydrology is in the area. So say you get out to an area that has, significantly dry, and you're thinking, all right, temperate, but somewhat semi-arid, but then you see some, facultative wetland plants. Well, that tells you, at least at some point in the recent history, this was significantly wetter than what you're seeing. And that's where, the research comes in, but you can also see the indicators, and that helps you as you do your research. Maybe that's broad-based research for that specific climate. But as you walk the site, I mentioned microclimates earlier, that you'll have those little microclimates. So where it kind of is intuitive for some folks, not understanding that, oh yeah, you have a drier area up here, but down here you actually have wetland plants. That may tell you that, hey, you have groundwater very close to the surface there, even if you're not seeing the water. So indicators of hydrology, not just present, but past, depending on the lifespan of whatever plant you're looking at. And then stormwater management. As I mentioned before, plant material can be very, very effective in these BMP best management practices, stormwater pond, treatment trains, constructed wetlands, and slowing down, not just slowing down in terms, so we're looking at managed stormwater in terms of quantity, but also quality, because those plants can also be very effective in treating the water as it moves through. Here in the Chesapeake Bay, we have significant, the three that they look at is sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen. And there's significant amount of grant money available for projects that work to reduce that. So by being able to reduce those, not just the quantity, but it slows it down so that sediment can drop out, and it can pull up that phosphorus and nitrogen. Plants love that stuff if you plant the appropriate one there. But so much so that it can actually treat wastewater, whether it be gray water from your laundry sinks, that kind of thing, washing machine, dishwasher, to even wastewater. Places are using constructed wetlands to treat wastewater because it's significantly cheaper. Some areas here, in the United States, I've seen them using constructed wetlands as part of a treatment train. You still have to be obviously concerned about the biological hazards of wastewater. But there's other places that I've worked that the electricity isn't reliable enough, the grid isn't reliable enough, so they use nature-based solutions because that's the options that they have, and the safest and most effective and the cheapest option for them. I'll also use the example with the state of New York, and the upstate is a pretty well-forested area. Well, one of the major landowners of the upstate New York forest is actually New York City, because that intact natural forest, as the rain hits, because that's kind of where their water originates and comes down, their drinking water, and it is significantly cheaper for them to buy that land and keep it in a natural environment, keep it forested, than it is for them to allow that to be developed and then have to treat the water as it gets to the city mechanically and chemically. It's cheaper to buy the land and let the natural process do the water treatment than it is for us to do it. Now, and this also helps drive the decisions of what are the appropriate plants for the site, not just in terms of climate, precipitation, and soil, but also, hey, what's going to help us accomplish our goal? Is our goal infiltration? Then we want plants that get in there and kind of break up the roots or the soil system and get, allow pathways for water to go in. Are we slowing down the water? Are we looking at pollinator? That where I have a place in West Virginia, they have programs that they'll come out and plant certain trees, native trees there, because it supports pollinators for the local agriculture. So Now moving into a few examples of this, talked already about stormwater management, and you do an ecological design doesn't necessarily mean that we don't use technology. We use appropriate technology. So yes, as I mentioned with New York, keeping that forest and wetland intact. So that's not stormwater management, that's water supply, but the same can be said for stormwater management. If you have natural areas, keeping them in their natural state can accomplish some of that goal. It costs you nothing aside from the loss of tax revenue from that land being used for something else. Detention then, as you move away from, you have the green infrastructure and then you have the gray infrastructure and the eco versus techno, as you move along that scale, there's detention basins, bioswales, vegetated wetlands, that kind of thing, green roofs, and then you get into the more technical, the sand pits with the underground filtering and infiltration facilities. And it tends to be seen more and more as you get from eco to techno that a lot of what drives that is just the space available. So if you have limited space in a highly urbanized environment, you have to go a little more technical because you don't, the ecological process may take up more room and you're in amongst a bunch of high rise as well. You only have a little bit of space. So, using the technical aspect, but still those, underground filtration and infiltration practices still follow the natural patterns. We've just taken it, tried to condense it, and because we had to condense it in a small space, had to be more technical and more gray infrastructure. Living shorelines, matter of fact, the state of Virginia and soon to be state of Maryland, if you want to change your shoreline, so if you have an erosion problem and you need to address that, living shorelines is the preferred method. So you have to use a living shoreline unless you prove why you have to use a bulkhead or a riprap revetment instead, because not only does that allow the ecological process with the relationship, speak of hydro-ecology, the relationship of that water body in the Chesapeake Bay or the tidal region, the estuaries of that, with the landsform, the ecological and biological processes that occur there. But a lot of times if you harden that shoreline, you just transfer the problem that you were having downstream to your neighbor's property. And it allows migration of this marshland, this tidal marshland, and then the upper marshland. It allows that to migrate as climate changes, and we're starting to see sea level rise firsthand. I used a background picture because that way is about 150 meters is the Chesapeake Bay on a peninsula. That way is a tidal estuary. And we're seeing, locally, we're already seeing the sea level rise because we have more flooding, more days of flooding, higher tides, that kind of thing. So this allows that to migrate inland as that occurs. And then from just an ecosystem service kind of perspective, you look at the mangroves along a lot of the areas that mangroves grow, they're replanting them because when they cut them down, they start having significant erosion issues, storm surge, and wave damage. Well, mangroves do an incredible job of attenuating storm surge and waves. So you may still get the volume of water rise up, but you won't get the damaging wave effect. And then a few other examples of this, like I mentioned, constructed wetlands, stormwater treatment, wastewater treatment, water purification, conservation landscaping. So when we look at this, not only do we have the human use, it's a parkland, so that's one function, because that's one of the other things through ecological design that we try to do is we try to accomplish as much as we can with every element. So we call it stacking functions. Get this one thing. So we'll use the function of the landscape here. We have the human use of parkland, recreation. It's aesthetically pleasing. So the surrounding area, you have property values go up from a monetary sense, but the aesthetic value, you also have the localized cooling effect. You have better water infiltration because of the roots and the plants. There's interception. So stormwater management, you have the interception of a canopy, but you also have infiltration. You have the shading. You have biodiversity increasing because those plants, while it's not a natural environment, will allow some of that natural biodiversity to occur in there, especially if you're using native plants. So, off the top of our heads, there's 6 ecosystem services functions that this landscape can provide. And then the final one I'll address, although plenty of examples, is xeriscaping. So if you're in a very arid environment, utilizing plants for landscaping that don't require nearly the amount of water, that are native to that area, that don't require the water, can save in ecosystem terms reduce the amount of impact because you're not pulling water for irrigation. You got biodiversity increase because you're using plants that are natural there. And this image isn't as good of it, but you notice that the plants are a little more spread out. Well, if you're in a fire-prone ecology, then by utilizing xeriscaping, stone mulch versus plant material right next to the house, you can actually reduce the amount of risk to the built environment and to people if you're in a fire ecology. So I mentioned some of the stuff that we do, the data mining that we do, but as far as the actual design work, GIS is incredibly significant for us. So one thing we have to understand is how the water moves across and through the landscape. So with GIS, not only do we get the mapping done and the good photogrammetry, we use the drones and we also use laser levels on site, but utilizing that GIS is incredibly helpful in understanding the topography because obviously water moves downhill. We use the term water moves perpendicular to the contours. That fancy way of saying water moves downhill. By understanding that, one, drives our design, but two, it also helps communicate to your clients, hey, this is why we're doing what we're doing. By being able to demonstrate, hey, by doing this one small intervention here, we can affect this much landscape and get the water to infiltrate. Because with water, we use the phrase, slow, soak, and spread it out. So by slowing the water down, not only do you decrease the damage, but by keeping that water on the landscape longer, allows for better infiltration. If we can spread it out and allow it to soak in, it helps a lot. And that's very low-tech way. And then you don't have the carbon footprint of pumping. You don't have, the groundwater withdrawing from aquifers that take decades, centuries, millennia to recharge. So we use that for the design work. We use typically most of the time with us, it's AutoCAD and Adobe Illustrator. AutoCAD mainly because it interacts a lot of times when we interact with municipalities, and a lot of people use AutoCAD, so that makes life easier. Adobe Illustrator kind of in-house makes life easier, and that's a little Adobe Illustrator next to the laser level at the top. But from a landscape architecture perspective, there are a slew of incredible amount of design software, so I couldn't cover all of them, and I'm not familiar with all of them. One of the things we use internally, we actually have an internal plant database. It's available, and this isn't a plug for the plant database, but we've collected over many, many years a lot of data on plants. So you can go into we go into this database, input, this is our climate, this is our region, this is our soil type, this is our moisture level, all of that thing, and it'll spit out, hey, these are the plants that are appropriate to your site. And sometimes also the polycultures. These are the mix of plants that work well together that you can put in your site. Often it's driven towards agroforestry, but it's very helpful in designing that because it also tells, from an aesthetic perspective, hey, this is the bloom time, this is the size that you can expect a mature plant, bloom times, color of flowers, maybe the root depth. So if you're working with, a fairly shallow water table, you don't want those deep-rooted plants if they're not able to handle deep, significantly wet roots. So the root depth, or you don't want the roots maybe competing with each other. So you're putting shallow-rooted plants next to deep-rooted plants so they're accessing different parts of the soil profile. And then, in terms of green infrastructure and ecosystem services, we don't do this in-house with UDI, but there are companies and places that do ecosystem service estimation. So if you're looking at a green infrastructure project, there are companies that you can go to and say, hey, this is what we're looking to do, and this is the problem we're looking at addressing. And they'll give you an estimation of, well, this is how much it would cost to implement this with green infrastructure. This is how much it would cost with gray infrastructure. This is your return on investment. This is how much money you save over the lifespan of this project, and all the different metrics that may be important not only to you as a designer, but to whoever the stakeholder is that cuts the check for that. And then finally, the last thing I'll mention, and I would encourage every one of you to be very, very deeply involved with this as it develops, is AI, the use of artificial intelligence. And I'll use the example, I think it was NOAA, National Atmospheric and Oceanic, or National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, trained an AI to do wetland delineation. Out of the gate, it was, now, yes, you had all the money and time of training that AI, but out of the gate, it was in the 90s of accuracy on wetland delineation. Now, if anybody's done wetland delineation, that usually takes a team of people and a significant amount of money to pay for the team and personnel hours, where AI, just looking at, we go back to the GIS, was able to do it in a short amount of time by itself with very minimal cost. So, I used AI can be a little disconcerting too because of where this goes. Who knows? But I subscribe to the theory that, AI is not going to replace people, but people that know how to use AI are going to replace people that don't. So I encourage all of you to be involved with that because it's exciting to use it as a tool. Yeah, there are scary aspects of it too, but as a tool for us, for design, it's exciting of what the potential for that is.